At exactly 7:53 in the evening on April 10th, 2026, 4 human beings traveling at nearly 25,000 miles per hour began falling toward Earth wrapped in a fireball. And for the next 6 minutes, nobody on the planet could reach them. Not mission control, not their families sitting in the viewing room a few feet away from the flight directors, not the recovery ships waiting off the coast of San Diego. Nobody. The Orion spacecraft named Integrity, carrying NASA astronauts Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, had just entered the most violent phase of its return from the moon, and physics had severed every radio signal connecting them to the rest of humanity. This is the story of those 6 minutes. What caused them? What the crew was experiencing inside that capsule, what the people in mission control were doing while they waited, and why those 6 minutes represent one of the most terrifying, most consequential, and most beautifully engineered moments in modern spaceflight. To understand why contact was lost, you have to understand what was physically happening to Orion in those minutes. The spacecraft had been traveling through deep space for nearly 10 days, completing a historic loop around the moon, the first time humans had traveled that far from Earth since Apollo 17 in 1972. After swinging around the far side of the moon and beginning the journey home, Orion was descending on a course aimed at the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. By the time it reached the upper boundary of Earth's atmosphere, 400,000 feet above the surface, roughly 76 miles up, it was moving at approximately 24,661 miles per hour. That is 35 times the speed of sound. It is fast enough to travel from New York to Tokyo in less than 20 minutes. And when something moving that fast hits an atmosphere, the air in front of it cannot move out of the way fast enough. It compresses, and compression generates heat. Within 24 seconds of entering the upper atmosphere, the heating across Orion's 16.5-foot heat shield built to the point that the surrounding air became electrically charged. The friction and compression of the descent created a plasma bubble, a sheath of superheated, ionized gas that completely engulfed the spacecraft. And here is the physical reality that no engineer can engineer around. Plasma blocks radio signals, not slows them, not degrades them, blocks them completely. The plasma layer surrounding Orion became an impenetrable electromagnetic wall between the spacecraft and the entire communications infrastructure of Earth. Every antenna in NASA's deep space network went silent. Every signal sent from Mission Control in Houston reached that plasma boundary and stopped. There was nothing to do but wait. The families in the viewing room went quiet, and the flight directors stared at their consoles showing no telemetry, no voice, no data. Just a flat line where 4 people had been a moment before. 1 minute and 22 seconds into the descent, temperatures across the heat shield reached their peak, approximately 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that number in terms your body can register, that is more than twice as hot as lava erupting from a volcano. It is roughly half the temperature of the visible surface of the sun, and that heat was being generated across the outer face of a 16.5-foot ceramic tile shield that was the only thing standing between the 4 astronauts inside and temperatures that would vaporize unprotected materials in milliseconds. The heat shield on Orion is made of a material called AVCOAT, a combination of epoxy resin and silica fibers designed to ablate, meaning to slowly burn off on the surface, carrying heat energy away from the capsule as the outer layer sacrifices itself. It is the same fundamental material used on the Apollo capsules half a century ago. And for the Artemis II crew, it was not a theoretical comfort. It was the literal difference between life and death, separated from them by about 18 inches of engineered material. And here is where the story gets genuinely more complicated, because the Artemis II heat shield was not coming into this moment with a clean record. When NASA recovered the Artemis-The spacecraft, the unpiloted test flight that flew a similar trajectory in 2022, engineers found more than 100 locations on the heat shield where the AVCOAT had failed and flaked away in unexpected ways. Cracks had formed. Material had broken off in fragments rather than ablating cleanly as designed. NASA's own Office of Inspector General concluded that any one of those failure points could have allowed the heat of re-entry to burn through the aluminum walls of the capsule, which is what destroyed the Space Shuttle Columbia and killed its 7-person crew in 2003. Engineers described what happened with Artemis-The as little more than dumb luck that none of the flaws led to a burn-through. And now for Artemis-II, the same capsule design, with modifications, with new AVCOAT formulations, with a revised re-entry trajectory, was carrying 4 actual human beings through the same fire. NASA's lead flight director for the re-entry, Jeff Radigan, stood in front of reporters the day before splashdown and said something that stayed with a lot of people. 13 things have to go right. He had a checklist in his head, 13 critical events, in sequence, each one depending on the one before it. The crew module had to separate cleanly from the service module at the right moment. The capsule had to reorient itself to position the heat shield correctly in the direction of travel. Entry had to occur at precisely the right angle, Too steep and the spacecraft would burn up, too shallow and it would skip off the atmosphere like a stone off water and be lost in deep space. Peak heating had to be survivable. The plasma blackout had to end on schedule. Then drogue parachutes had to deploy. Then main parachutes. Then splashdown at a survival speed. Then the capsule had to float. 13 things, each one non-negotiable. And during 6 of those 13 minutes, nobody on Earth had any way of knowing what was actually happening inside the capsule. The former astronaut, Charles Camarda, had raised his voice in the months before Artemis II's return, writing directly to NASA leadership to warn that engineers did not fully understand the root cause of the Artemis 1 heat shield damage. He invoked a line that had haunted the space agency since the Challenger and Columbia disasters. History shows accidents occur when organizations convince themselves they understand problems they do not. That warning was made by someone who had spent his career inside the system, who knew what it looked like when institutional confidence outpaced actual knowledge. And NASA's associate administrator, Amit Kshatriya, stood before cameras and said with steady conviction that they had full confidence in the heat shield, that the engineering, the ground tests, the Artemis 1 data, all of it supported the assessment that the system would work. And then he added a sentence that cut through everything. Tomorrow, the crew is going to put their lives behind that. Confidence, 6 minutes. Trust the physics, trust the engineering, and wait. Inside Mission Control, the flight directors and flight controllers were doing the only thing they could during the blackout, monitoring what data remained available from systems that didn't require radio contact, running their own checklists, and managing something that none of the training fully prepares you for. Being completely helpless at the most critical moment of a mission you have spent years of your life building. The families of the 4 astronauts were in the adjacent viewing room. Astronaut families during re-entry are never far from that threshold between procedure and grief. They have been briefed. They understand the blackout. They have been told it is expected, planned, normal, and they still go quiet when the signal flatlines, because understanding something in your mind and feeling it in your body are 2 different things. Thousands of miles away in the Pacific, the USS John P. Murtha, the amphibious recovery ship, and its accompanying vessels were in position, waiting. Navy divers and helicopters were ready. NASA had simulated this recovery dozens of times, including deploying a full-scale Orion mock-up into the ocean, so the Navy team could practice every step until it was muscle memory. The 6 minutes of communication blackout were not the only silence Artemis II experienced. Earlier in the mission on April 6th, as Orion swung behind the far side of the moon for its closest lunar approach, Mission Control lost contact for a different reason. The moon itself, 259 miles in diameter, sitting between the spacecraft and Earth, physically blocked every radio signal. That blackout lasted approximately 40 minutes, and during it, the 4 astronauts were not just out of radio range. They were the most isolated human beings in history, farther from other people than anyone had ever been. 252,756 miles from Earth at their maximum distance, breaking the record set by the Apollo 13 crew in 1970 by more than 4,000 miles. During those 40 minutes of lunar blackout, they witnessed something that no human eyes had seen in over 50 years. An Earth set, the moment Earth itself slipped below the lunar horizon, and they were alone on the far side of a world that no human footprint has ever touched. In silence that had no precedent in human experience. And there was a third blackout, smaller but still significant. On flight day 9, roughly 2 hours before a critical trajectory correction burn, there was an unexpected loss of signal during a data rate change. Not planned, not in the timeline, just a brief technical anomaly that caused a temporary loss of telemetry and communications between the spacecraft and the ground. It was reestablished quickly. The burn proceeded successfully. The universe does not make promises. It simply presents conditions, and the engineers and the crew do their best to have already solved every problem they can think of before any of them actually occur. Back to April 10th and those 6 minutes. At around 8:03 p.m. Eastern Time, the drogue parachutes deployed. 2 smaller chutes designed to slow and stabilize the capsule at around 22,000 feet altitude. That was the signal. Orion had survived peak heating. The heat shield had held. The plasma boundary had passed. A minute later, at about 6,000 feet, the 3 main parachutes deployed, each one weighing 300 pounds, spanning wide enough to fill the interior of a large building, slowing a spacecraft that had been traveling at 24,000 miles per hour down toward a splashdown speed of 20 miles per hour. And in Mission Control, when that signal came through and the voice of Commander Reid Wiseman crackled back over the comm system from inside the capsule, still descending, still 5 minutes from the water, but alive, communicating safe, the tension that had been building for 6 minutes released all at once. The lead flight director described it afterward as the irrational fear that is human nature finally letting go. It was not irrational, it was entirely appropriate to the stakes. Orion hit the Pacific Ocean at 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time on April 10th, 2026. The splashdown was described by the people watching as a bullseye. Navy divers were in the water around the capsule within minutes. One by one, the 4 astronauts were extracted. Christina Koch first, then Victor Glover, then Jeremy Hansen, then Commander Wiseman, and hoisted into Navy helicopters and flown to the flight deck of the USS John P. Murtha. All 4 walked to the medical bay with minimal assistance, 9 days, 1 hour, and 31 minutes after liftoff. A total journey of 694,681 miles. A new human distance record, the first crewed lunar mission in over 50 years. And a 6-minute window inside a plasma fireball that nobody in mission control could see through, that no radio signal could penetrate, that 4 astronauts rode out in a machine made of ceramic tiles and 60-year-old epoxy chemistry, trusting the engineering because there was nothing else to do. NASA's program manager for the Orion spacecraft, watching from mission control, said the mission had been thousands of times better than Star Wars. The astronauts' families cheered twice during re-entry. Once when the signal came back, and once when the capsule hit the water. Jeff Radigan, the flight director, said that what made him want to keep doing this work was simple. It's the first of many trips. There is so much more to learn. And Reid Wiseman, the commander, said that what they had hoped in their soul was that for just one moment the world might pause and remember that Earth is a beautiful planet, a very special place in the universe, something to be cherished. 4 human beings had just traveled 250,000 miles away from it and come back through a wall of fire to tell us that. 6 minutes of silence. And then everything was fine. That is what the engineering was for. That is what the 13 things going right looks like when they all go right. And that is why, when the signal came back, and the voice came through, and the parachutes were confirmed, and the capsule hit the water, and the crew walked out into the Pacific air, in mission control, and in the viewing room, and on the USS John P. Murtha, and in living rooms around the world watching on screens, people who had been holding their breath for 6 minutes finally let it go. There is something that does not get discussed enough in the coverage of the Artemis II re-entry, and it is this. The 6-minute blackout during re-entry is fundamentally different from the 40-minute blackout behind the moon, even though the outcome, loss of signal, silence, waiting, looks the same from the outside. Behind the moon, the blackout is caused by geometry. The moon is simply in the way. The crew inside Orion knew exactly where they were, what was happening, what would happen next. The spacecraft was stable and coasting. There was nothing particularly dangerous about those 40 minutes other than their isolation. Mission Control knew with complete certainty that the spacecraft would emerge from behind the moon and the signal would return, because the laws of orbital mechanics guaranteed it. The flight director for that phase put it simply. Physics takes over, and physics will absolutely get us back to the front side of the moon. The re-entry blackout is different in every dimension that matters. It does not happen because of geometry. It happens because the spacecraft is being destroyed on its outer surface, deliberately by design, and the byproduct of that controlled destruction is a plasma sheath that eliminates communication. During the 40-minute lunar blackout, the crew had nothing particularly urgent to do. During the 6-minute re-entry blackout, everything was happening simultaneously. Temperatures peaking at 5,000 degrees, the heat shield undergoing its most extreme stress, the capsule being decelerated from 24,000 miles per hour. The crew experiencing up to 3.9 times the force of Earth's gravity pressing them into their seats. Their bodies, after 9 days of weightlessness, suddenly remembering what gravity feels like and relearning it at 4 times its normal intensity. And all of it happening in a silence that no one outside the capsule could break. The crew knew the blackout was coming. They had trained for it. Every astronaut who has returned from space has trained for re-entry, and every one of them describes the same sensation, an intellectual acceptance of what is happening alongside a physical experience that no simulation fully prepares you for. Retired astronaut Butch Wilmore, who had been through re-entry 3 times during his own career, described it in interviews before Artemis II's return as simply pressing through. You know the blackout is coming. There is not a lot you can do. You monitor. You execute your procedures. You trust the machine, and you press through. That description, calm, professional, procedural, is the language of people who have learned to manage their own fear by reducing it to a checklist. It does not mean the fear is absent. It means the training has made the procedures more powerful than the fear, at least for 6 minutes at a time. And this is what the Artemis program exists to test before the stakes get even higher. Artemis III, planned for 2028, will attempt to land a crew on the surface of the moon for the first time since 1972. Those astronauts will survive the same re-entry on the way home through the same 6 minutes of fire and silence. Every temperature reading from Artemis II, heat shield sensors, every structural measurement, every second of recorded avcoat behavior during peak heating, all of it becomes data that engineers analyze before the next crew boards the next rocket. The 6 minutes of terror are not just drama, they are a test. And the Artemis II crew passed it for everyone who comes after them. At 8:07 p.m. on April 10, 2026, the Orion spacecraft named Integrity splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. 9 days, 1 hour, and 31 minutes after launch. 694,481 total miles traveled. A new human distance record, 4,111 miles further from Earth than any human being had ever been before. In a 6-minute window that no signal could cross, the 4 astronauts survived inside a capsule made of ceramic tiles and epoxy resin, and 50 years of accumulated human knowledge about what it takes to come home from the moon. Mission accomplished. Signal restored. Welcome home.